Hello, everyone, and welcome to the MoPod, brought to you by MoDate, where we discuss everything Mo, from modern orthodoxy to my opinions and more. I'm your host, Evan Harris, and we have a great guest for you today. Let's get to it. Today, we're sitting down with Aliza Kline, founder of OneTable. How are you, Aliza?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
So, before we really get into it, I'm just wondering, can you spell the word entrepreneur?
Yes. Do I have to do it now?
No, you don't have to do it now. So, let's dive into your background, where you're from, and what is OneTable, but first just where you're from and
Sure.
your career history.
Sure. I grew up actually in Colorado Springs, Colorado, which is not a booming Jewish community population. It is physically very beautiful and politically rather sort of odd. My father was the rabbi in Colorado Springs. Friday night was affiliated with a with the Reform movement. Saturday morning was with the conservative movement. I spent my spare time in high school in Denver with the B'nai B'rith Youth Organization, BBYO, which was probably the most kind of pluralistic experience. Very common, especially in areas like Colorado, where all the Jews need each other. So my dearest friends were modern Orthodox, conservative, Reform, totally unaffiliated, a couple of recons in there. But so that's a little bit of the Jewish path. And my mom was a professional dancer and arts administrator and really nonprofit entrepreneur. And so I really think that I'm the product of my dad, the Bible scholar and lover of all things Jewish teaching and wisdom, and my mom, who is an artist who really valued the aesthetic and sort of came to Judaism later in her life. And so the two were very intentional about what they designed as our kind of home Jewish life.
Gotcha. Very interesting. So, for all of our listeners who don't know, what is OneTable?
So OneTable is it's like Airbnb for Shabbat dinner is the shorthand I would use. It's a web-based platform where people can go online, apply to be a Shabbat dinner host. You don't need to have a whole lot of Shabbat practice yet. We will provide and help you get there, but you need to be kind and generous and be excited to open up your home. When you apply to the platform, you basically create a profile, like the way Airbnb has host profiles. And you are asked a number of questions to kind of articulate the intention that you have around this Shabbat dinner experience. Then your guests, whether they're people that you know or people who you're open to having people you've never met before, go back onto that same platform to onetable.org and register as a guest. They create a guest profile. And what we've learned is many of the guests may have some relationship to the host directly or indirectly, like they're a plus one, but they don't often know the other guests at the dinners. So there's a real opportunity to create that kind of connection. So the dinners themselves happen in real life, but like Meetup was designed. I don't know if you ever interviewed David Siegel, but you should. But Meetup is similarly designed so that you have a host profile and participant profiles, and then you go online to organize, but the event itself is, of course, in person. We have absolutely had some virtual Shabbat dinners during the pandemic, but they're wildly unpopular. Much more popular, thank God, is to really help people meet in person. Since OneTable started in 2014, so it's coming on 9 years, we've had close to 90,000 Shabbat dinners for close to 200,000 people, primarily in the demographic of 21 to 39-ish. So no longer in college, not yet having kids, is the majority of the people who use our platform.
Wow, that's a lot of Shabbat dinners. So
It's a lot of Shabbat dinners.
Yeah, how did everything start?
So OneTable, it's really an important origin story, especially for those of you out there who are thinking about building your own anything. It was really a partnership with philanthropists. So there were two significant philanthropists who had invested not uncommonly in Birthright. One of them was the Steinhardt Foundation from Jewish Life, and they were actually one of the initial visionaries behind Birthright. The other is the Paul E. Singer Foundation, which is really sort of brand new to the Jewish philanthropic scene. So the idea was for them to collaborate together, and they, I think we're looking for a way to avoid what they called sort of the Birthright cliff, right? Tens of thousands of people going on Birthright, having a transformative, beautiful experience, meeting other Jewish adults sometimes for the first time. And then they come back and there was a cliff, like there wasn't a whole lot of involvement. of opportunities after. And there was a research that talked about, from Brandeis did research about, what's great on the trip, Shabbat. A lot of people like Friday night dinner. What's really nice is to bring people together. And the question was, how do you actually help create something like that at scale? So it has to be designed from day one to be able to work for tens of thousands of people on an annual basis, maybe even more. Has to be deeply connected to Jewish life and tradition, but has to also really, from my perspective, be designed for the end user in mind. So I was hired, they interviewed, these two foundations together created a corporation, and they interviewed a number of people who I think were like really into Shabbat, really into dinner, really into building community around dinner. And they wanted to take an idea they already had and bring it to scale. And when they interviewed me, my concept was to bring the frame of design thinking, which I'm happy to geek out with you about if you're not already deeply familiar. But basically, it's sort of a Silicon Valley language for how to create a new program or product or experience based on the needs of the end user. It seems so fundamental, but a lot of Jewish life, the question is how much of it is designed for the end user, how much of it is designed to sustain our people, how much of it is designed for Torah. So those questions shift when we try and think about how do we make an experience that we know is so beautiful and meaningful, actually accessible and meaningful to way more people. That's what I brought into my interview with these two with the kind of the professionals and some of the family members from those two foundations. So that was at the end of 13. And they gave me about 6 months to start showing some facts on the ground, which is a very rapid design process to create something that hopefully will grow to this scale. The first thing we did was my first hire really was this person named Jamie Batesh, now Carter, who was an expert in market research. So she hired 10 observers who were in their 20s, some in their early 30s, all around New York City, to just go all over the place on Friday nights to see what people were doing on a Friday and understand what people wanted to be doing and what was getting in the way. If you look at a net promoter score for Shabbat dinner, it's off the charts positive. It's so good that you're like, that is not helpful. Net promoter score, for those who may not know, is basically saying I would encourage a friend to use this product. So who doesn't enjoy a delicious, wonderful, home-cooked, social Friday night meal? No one. Everybody does. But that does not translate into people doing it. So that becomes the design challenge. And that became the initial conversation between me and these original funders to see if we could create something that actually was designed for those people who would like this, but were not doing it on their own. And that was like an amazing opportunity for me to get creative and think what we could create together.
Gotcha. That's very interesting. So I'm wondering, when you first were starting OneTable, and even now, was the main thing you had in mind kind of bringing people who might not have Shabbat dinners to have this experience, or was it to have people meeting people they didn't know, or was it kind of a combination of both?
It's great. So I would say, like many, sort of large scale Jewish philanthropically supported efforts, there is almost always a kind of central focus on moving the needle for people who would not be doing Shabbat otherwise. So that was always the goal. And we just did data, which is that 75% of OneTable users are now doing Shabbat who would not otherwise. So cha-ching, that's very good. Now, the other 25% is two different camps, right? It's some people who are already doing Shabbat, and OneTable helps them do it more or differently, but we're not moving the needle in their own personal practice. Or some people came and don't continue to do it, right? That's always a possibility. When we started, though, the question is, who's your early adopters? So Shabbat is not a new. I did not invent. I'd love to take credit, but God really gets the credit for Shabbat. Like it's just really beautifully designed. It's part and parcel of the whole creation of how the world came into being. Shabbat dinner, I also didn't invent, but we sure have changed the way people are perceiving it. So some of our original thought partners and our early adopters already love Shabbat. I grew up with Shabbat dinner every single week. I am what we call an always, always. So when you apply to be a Shabbat dinner host through OneTable, one of the ways we collect a little bit of like understanding your background is we want to know if you're on the never to always scale. You never did Shabbat, you sometimes did Shabbat, you frequently do Shabbat, you always do Shabbat. What's interesting to me is, by the way, the frequently and the sometimes. So as a person, I don't know, Evan, how you grew up, but for me, there was no Friday night without Shabbat dinner. That was like an impossible equation for me. But I have met more and more people for whom it is a frequent experience, maybe once a month or every other month. And it's something they consider themselves that they do, but it's not necessarily a habitual practice. So that we ask, are they never, sometimes, frequently, always? And we ask when they're growing up. And we also ask now as a young adult, because there's also really interesting folks, probably some of your listeners, who may have grown up with Shabbat with their families every week as a regular thing. And now that they're on their own, they have to actually think about it and frame it and decide if they're going to prioritize it. And the opposite. And I know you've also talked with people who found Judaism later in their life. So they didn't grow up with any practice. And now, whether it's because they're literally converting to Judaism or they're meeting new people in college or through work or through their friend group, and they are doing Shabbat and they love it and they want to adopt the practice. So those are we have the never nevers and always always, and then the in-betweens. So OneTable was not designed for the always alwayses. However, if you're an always always like me, and you love Shabbat and you're pretty good at hosting it, we'd love you to work with us and open up your table for people who might not have the experience. So then it becomes more about who are you inviting to the dinner that you do with OneTable. So if you do Shabbat every week, you're probably not going to use OneTable every week. But when you do use OneTable, who are you inviting who might not otherwise be doing Shabbat? So some of our early adopters and even current users who may identify as modern Orthodox or as kind of active Shabbat practitioners, that's when they sometimes have their colleagues from work over, right? Or they'll invite people to bring friends of friends, so that it's just an opportunity for them to do what they might not otherwise. And OneTable provides nourishment credit. So that's equivalent of $10 per seat at the table that you can use for groceries or prepared foods. Some people have literally bought a table, wine glasses, sometimes Judaica, clay kodesh, things that make their table more beautiful, sometimes flowers. Really, the goal is for you, the host, to tell us what it would make it easier for you to create an elevated, beautiful experience. So we know some people, even who have a regular Shabbat practice, it's hard for them to invite guests because it could be a week's worth of groceries. So OneTable can mitigate that concern and help you be as gracious a host as you can be.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's very interesting. So I have a few questions off of what you just said, but let's start with this. So I am an always, always. And I think and I think that a lot of our listeners, probably most, are also always, always.
Yeah.
But at the same time, on the Upper West Side, there's this huge meal culture where a lot of our listeners are living right now and where I live right now.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it's meals with people you already know and friends, but sometimes it's meals with trying to meet new people. I mean, even on this podcast, we had two people, Amanda Sham and Yala Rosenrausch, who started their own group called Eat and Meet, where they're setting up meals. But at least I don't know, but I don't think they're using something like OneTable.
I hope they do. We should encourage them to.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that it's a resource that a lot of people who might be like always, always don't realize that is at their disposal. But then going off of that, how do you prevent people from abusing the system?
Sure. There are always bad actors.
Yeah.
I really wish that there were not. When OneTable was first starting, I actually met with a number of people from Silicon Valley, just like, okay, we're building this out. How do you deal with security? I met with someone from eBay, for example, who was explaining to me that when they first started, they had all of these rules. As people would do stupid or mean things, they would try and create a specific rule to it. People were selling murder paraphernalia, just disgusting things. Like, so if someone did a mass shooting and then they were in a movie theater and then they would resell the movie tickets, like just disgusting things that obviously eBay did not want on their platform. So they started with these very specific goals, and then with specific kind of reactive rules, and then kind of grew to figure out how to make it, things that were sometimes harder to define, but that they could very quickly take you off the platform if they felt like you were violating their customs. So one of the things we did right away is we have, there's a commitment that you make as a host or as a guest. You have to sign our the codes of conduct, and we went through like both just like don't be an asshole, which is first of all, but also then if you're a guest who shows up and you make other guests uncomfortable, you're one and done with OneTable. Like we have a very low tolerance for bad behavior once you're on the platform. And then for people who may want to sort of game the system, we have just added layers, which is a bummer. I think every tech company's also had to figure this out. Like we have to add in 2FA, which is two-factor authentication, right? So when you sign up for OneTable, you have to use your phone. So if it's the same IP address, like we have absolutely had people try to game or manipulate the system over the 8 years that, 8-9 years that we've been in existence. Sometimes we catch it right away. Sometimes it takes a little longer, which is a total drag. But we have to assume, which is what I learned from kind of eBay and my friends at Craigslist that I spoke to, which is that you have to assume goodwill. Otherwise, you can't actually do any of your work. So the numbers of people who have behaved badly that we've needed to take off the platform is such a fraction of 1% when you look at the total number, that you keep that in mind. But you also have to be smart. So also, the dinners themselves, especially with rising anti-Semitism, we're not like, hey, here's a bunch of Jews getting together at a big event. So the addresses are revealed once you have RSVP'd. Every host has the choice to make their dinner totally private or guest host approval, meaning Evan, I'm hosting a dinner and I was like, hey, we have a few extra seats. And Evan's like, I'd like one of those seats. And then I can, through the app or through other socials, say, hey, who are you, Evan? Tell me about yourself. Are you an always like me? And then you'll get the address, right? So we've done our best to build in those sort of checks and balances.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, very interesting. Does OneTable host any larger scale events? Is that something that's in the works, or?
So yes and no. We never wanted to compete with our own users. So that was really important. And at the same time, pre-pandemic, which was like a totally different iteration of the product of OneTable. So pre-pandemic, yes, there were a lot of different things. In New York City, there's actually, there was a range of events that we would either co-host with a person. One person did like a rap Shabbat where they threw out challahs into the audience. There's a boat on the, literally a boat docked on the Upper West Side. And we know the owner, and we had this beautiful Shabbat dinner on this boat. So we've hosted a number of events. We did one with an apron company in California, like really thinking about especially ways to attract people for whom Shabbat dinner is just not a normal part of their practice, and connect it with brands that they find meaningful to sort of really invite them in. Once the pandemic hit, large events just sort of went by the wayside. And also the staff we recruited often were now much more accustomed to working from their bedrooms, like I'm sure many of your listeners. And so we are now just starting to move that needle back out again. Dinners at OneTable used to be on average 12 to 14 people before the pandemic. When the pandemic hit, we had double the number of dinners. So we went from about 200 a week to 400 to 500 a week. We're now between 500 and 600 dinners a week. But instead of having 12 people on average, now there's 7 or 8 people. For a long time, it was like 4, 5 people, like just your roommates, or just you and your partner, or just you by yourself. Like the average went way down. We have just now opened up and said, have 30 people. Here's $10 a seat for 30 people, to see if we can get people to move to 8, 9 people. And there are now, because of that, more dinners with 30 people, 50 people on the platform. But our goal is, as much as possible, to support our users as hosts rather than to become the hosts ourselves.
Gotcha. So totally veering off into something else. I mean, that's definitely interesting to have, like, I see what you're saying about Airbnb, because you kind of are the software,
right?
But the hosts and the users are really the product.
Correct.
And so
correct.
That's definitely a very cool business model, also like the Uber business model. And so
that's how we can scale, by the way, right? So there's only one of me. I can literally only do 52 Shabbatot a year. Maybe on certain years I can do 53 if it's an extra, like it's the bonus year, right? But I can tell you there is only 53 Fridays in the next year. And so even if I have 20 people on staff, and I have about 44 currently on staff, we could only still be limited by that number. But instead, we are unlimited. The limitations come in terms of philanthropic support, recruitment, other things. But it's not about the number of events that we can host. It's a totally different model.
Gotcha. Yeah, it definitely makes sense. So you have grown OneTable
Yeah.
to 500 plus dinners a week, and you're obviously very established and the biggest player in this Shabbat dinner game, I guess you could say. And so where do you go from here? Like you yourself as
Great.
to motivate you to keep going, keep improving, and does it ever get hard?
Yeah, I mean, it gets hard a lot. We're now, it costs us about 7.8 to $8 million to support. Right now we're about 25,000 dinners this year. So my biggest expense, like any organization for sure, is going to be the staff, the quality of the staff that it takes to do that,
Mhm.
and also the direct program. Like the nourishment is a big chunk of our budget.
Mhm.
We have about 140,000 meals served, like seats at Shabbat dinner tables. That's about $10 per seat. So that's just 1.4 million just for
Yeah.
underwriting the nourishment, plus then the staffing support. We invest a lot in our research. We invest a lot in our technology. So I am I spend a lot of my time meeting with philanthropists to generate as much income for as much, as I possibly can to meet the goals. We see growth. We just set a strategic plan called Setting the Next Course. You
Mhm.
can all,
Okay.
yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
All table puns are totally welcome, and you can go Shulchan Aruch and MoPod too. Like you can just
Yeah.
the Jews are rife with table analogies, which is awesome. So we're two different things that we're growing. First of all, we just want to grow. We just did a massive study last year with 2,000 OneTable users and 800 other young adults in a comparison group to just understand, like, does making Shabbat make an impact in your life? It sure seems like it does.
Mhm.
And now I can tell you for fact, with really statistically significant data that it does, but that's expensive to do the research. But one of the things that the research showed was, in addition to people really now practicing Shabbat who wouldn't otherwise, deepening their connection to other Jews, forming relationships, even experimenting with other Jewish rituals well beyond Shabbat, it's also making a difference in terms of social and emotional connections. So we use something called the De Jong Gerveld loneliness study, which is it's 7 questions. They use it at UCLA, and we just inserted those questions into our survey. Because of that, I can tell you that OneTable users are 3 times less likely, which is huge, 3 times less likely to report social and emotional loneliness, like feelings of I feel rejected most of the time. I have no one to call. Like that is how America is right now. And there is at least a correlation between those who use OneTable and much lower numbers, which is really good. So that's a serious call to action for us. So right now we should be getting 40 to 50,000 people to use OneTable this year. We'd like to grow that to 65, 85, 100, even more in the next 3 years. So that's super energizing for me. The second is we are white labeling our technology. So that basically means other organizations or even businesses can license and customize the OneTable technology platform for their own needs, and they pay us a fee to do that. So we're
Gotcha.
building out a whole department. We have client success managers who work for OneTable and directly support other companies and organizations. And we're also starting to experiment with something called Together at OneTable, which would see what it's like to have the same kind of OneTable resource for your parents' generation, for empty nesters
Uh-huh.
who are reporting the same levels of loneliness and social isolation. In many cases, they're leaving their congregations. They might be moving the same way. 25% of millennials and Gen Z literally picked up and moved in the past few years. That's a huge percentage of the population.
Mhm.
And we're starting to see similar trends with people in their 50s and 60s. So that's kind of interesting to think about. So it's endlessly interesting to me. We also just got an exciting research grant to study the connection between Shabbat dinner and human flourishing, which I don't know exactly what that means yet, but it's
Yeah.
cool to think about. This again, it's the stuff that those of us who celebrate Shabbat, we know. Like I think about Shabbat as my oxygen. Like I
Mhm.
don't really think I could make it through without knowing that relief, that challah, that connection, that love, the deep breath, all of that is coming. Um, so what does it actually mean, and why is it so good? Is it about the ritual, the food, the time, the people? So we're going to pull it apart and study it a little bit. So all of that keeps me super energized.
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely fascinating. And I think obviously it's amazing what you do and what OneTable is doing for people. And just from so many different standpoints, like the mental health thing, it might not even
Yeah.
be what people are thinking about, but 3 times less likely to consider themselves lonely, and that's amazing. So
Yeah.
kudos to you,
Thanks.
and that's really great. And we're gonna move on to
Okay.
a segment we do here on the MoPod called the MoPod Lightning Round,
Okay.
where I'm just gonna fire off some quick questions. You can tell me the first thing that comes to your mind. You ready?
Okay. Ready.
How many tables is too many tables?
There is no such thing as too many tables. More is
Oh,
more.
okay. I was thinking maybe 2 tables because it's only 1 table, but okay. Uh, where was the most interesting place you ever spent Shabbos?
Me personally, I'm going to say, hold on. I think probably on a camping trip between Colorado and Wisconsin, where we stopped by a lake and there were no showers. And so we had to prepare for Shabbat, swimming in the river and then setting the table and trying to get all the cooking done with a cooler to make Shabbat beautiful. That's what I would go with. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's definitely different. What is the hardest part of running a nonprofit?
There's a lot of politics to navigate. And I think the hardest part for me is probably sometimes translating the needs of the end user with the needs and the investments of the investor.
Gotcha. Good answer. What's one book you think everyone with an entrepreneurial spirit should read?
I really liked Nir Eyal's book. Oh, geez. It's about habit formation. I don't know if I have it right in front of me, but it basically gave me the formula B equals MAT, behavior equals motivation plus ability plus trigger. That's totally changed my life. It's changed everything. So you have to figure out, are you in the M or the A or the T business, right? Are you trying to motivate people to do the behavior? Are you going to help them be more have the ability to do it, or are you the trigger? And at OneTable every Tuesday, we're like, hey, Shabbat's coming, Shabbat is coming, Shabbat is coming. I think we're in the trigger business. People already have the motivation, and the question is, what are the abilities that they need? So that was the big one for me. Nir Eyal, and I think it's Habit Formation is the book.
Okay. What is your favorite Shabbos food?
Challah.
Okay. What fictional character would you most want to have at a Shabbos meal?
A fictional character. I mean, I didn't want a fictional character. I want a comedian. Like I just had Shabbat. We just had like a faux Shabbat dinner with Alex Edelman. Do you know him? Oh my God, he's great. You should have him on your podcast.
Yeah.
And he loves Shabbat dinner, and he's very, very funny. And he's modern Orthodox or grew up that way, and so he'd be good for you guys. But I just love to laugh so much that I would love to have the whole dinner with comedians and just enjoy that.
Okay. Thank you, Aliza, for coming on the MoPod. Anything else you want our listeners to know before we sign off?
I mean, I'm psyched. I'm thrilled that you guys are embracing this and thinking about, I really want to actually learn more about MoDate, but I also think Shabbat is the perfect time to meet your beloved. I vetted my husband entirely when he hosted me and my siblings for Shabbat dinner, and that's when I knew I was going to marry him. So I feel like, dating and Shabbat dinner definitely have an opportunity to elevate both practices because, if he makes a good challah or if he knows how to set a table, that is someone you should be paying attention to.
Yeah, we totally agree and really appreciate the work you're doing. Pop the volume.